Well, hello, Ruckus Maker. Today I am joined by Dr. Glover, a servant leader committed to equity and inclusion. She's a former educator, administrator, human resource manager, and diversity, equity, and inclusion professional. In 2017, Dr. Glover earned her doctorate degree in urban education from Cleveland State University. With an emphasis on policy and planning, Dr. Glover has transferred her learning into reimagining the ways in which we socialize scholars, future teachers, and current educators. More recently, Dr. Glover self-published her first book, Centering Student Voice, a guide for cultivating emotionally intelligent educators and culturally responsive classrooms. She is the daughter of Joseph and Cheryl Glover. She has one brother, one sister, and is the mother of Kylan Richburg. In her spare time, she enjoys reading, traveling, and spending time with family. Dr. Glover, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Danny. It's a pleasure to be here today. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I want to get to your equity story in a second, but I have to ask because we're streaming this live. It's January, and the book is now out, right? Centering Student Voice, and this will come out as a podcast, months in the future too. So it's still available, and Ruckus Makers should pick up Centering Student Voice. But how does it feel, right? That's your first book. It's out there in the world now. It's on an important topic. Just want to check in with you. How does it feel?
Yeah, that's a really good question because I remember receiving the author proofs and
Yeah.
opening and like I almost cried. And I was emotional because I remember growing up wanting to be a professional basketball player, right?
Yeah.
I mean, I used to design my own shoes on paper and try to
There you go.
autograph everything.
Sure.
I
Yeah.
never ever thought about being an author. And so
Okay.
for that to happen in a way that was for me unplanned, and
Mm.
then also in a way that connected back to my ongoing experiences, right? Um,
Mm-hmm.
was 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 surprising, was uplifting, and very much close to just making space to honor my ancestors. So
Mm.
you have a book. There's something that lives beyond even your own years, and
Yeah.
so
Yeah.
I'm really excited about the opportunity to even have it, and then to be able to self-publish in itself was pretty cool as well.
Yeah. So I don't know if you know this. My wife is she's from Zimbabwe,
Oh
and
wow.
I'll often ask her like, "What's the recipe?" Right? Like, how do you cook that thing? And she,
Yeah.
oh, I don't use recipes, Danny. She goes, I channel my ancestors, and I'm like, all right, that's cool.
Yes.
I'm gonna try to do that too. But can you give me the steps? Talk to me a little bit about that though. You said like honoring the ancestors. What does that mean to you? Why is that important?
Well, it really goes back to the why I'm here. And when I
Mm-hmm.
say the why, that without my ancestors, right, I wouldn't be here today. That's number one. Number
Yeah.
two, it's also connected to the stories and the experiences, the lived experience that I've learned about my ancestors. That leads me to this idea, notion of disrupting that I am doing today. And so there are some ancestors that have made their mark on this world in very various ways, and
Mm-hmm.
this is an opportunity for me to not really just leave my mark, but share something to my ancestors in the future. To share a story and experience that is different than what they are reading now. And I believe that we owe that to each other. I believe that we are connected to each other. Outside of the space of true, familial relationships. And so when I say honor my ancestors, I'm speaking to all of those who have dwelled in the space of disrupting, abolitionists, anything that really speaks to, supporting the experiences, providing opportunity and access of marginalized groups of people. I understand that that is why I am on purpose to be here today.
Great. And we're going to dig into that, this whole idea of disruption university. I think that's very much aligned, with the Ruckus Maker brand and vibe that we have as well. So can't wait to talk more about that. But let's go back, and I would just love to hear, what is your equity story?
Yeah, so been in education over 20 years. And
Okay.
when I began, I started out as a long-term substitute teacher. So I graduated from college with my degree in education, hadn't taken the test to pass to get a
Mm.
certification, right? So I'll never forget, I entered into the classroom where the teacher, I'm not sure exactly what the ending was, but it ended in the middle of the school year. And if you're in a
Okay.
space education, you know that when something ends in the middle of the school year, there's something interesting that could have happened.
Yeah.
So I walked into a classroom and it wasn't the ideal, what a lot of people might define as the ideal classroom. My scholars were self contained. So they were categorized as having an emotional disability. They were high school students and they were all reading and learning at, I mean, from third grade level all the way to 10th grade level. And
Mhm.
I'll never forget the coordinator that supported me through the process of me being onboarded into the position. Right before she walked out of the classroom, she looked at me and said, Erica, don't worry about anything else, but just build relationships. Right. So
Hmm.
I'm fresh, out of college, just really, passionate about the opportunity, not really understanding what that meant. So I did that
Right.
though. I always had really good relationships with my scholars. And there's one particular, every morning we read a quote, we applied the quote to what was happening in the real world, to their lives. And I was really intentional about that, right? So there's one
Mhm.
particular morning we read the quote and unplanned, not really even understanding why it happened at the moment that it did. But in my mind and out of my mouth popped out the words, you know what? You know what, y'all? Like, where else do you see people spending time in one place all day where folks are telling them
Mhm.
when to go to the restroom, when they can eat, when they can have recess? And one of my scholars, and like, and I'm getting goosebumps thinking about how he sounded when he said prison. And
Yeah.
so it was at that moment that that I believe my critical reflection and my current position was actually, in my opinion, supporting them towards a process of school to prison pipeline. Like I felt like I was helping them to practice being prepared for prison by
Hmm.
being complicit and allowing them to be okay and sitting in this space all day, being told when to go to the restroom, being told, all of those things. And then it was at that moment that I started to even look at their IEPs differently. I'm like digging. I'm like, well, why is this young person in a self-contained? What could he or she or they have possibly done, right, to be in a self-contained unit? And started to realize, in my personal opinion, it just seemed to be a consistent lack of sustainable relationships that ended up influencing academics over time. And so it was at that moment that I realized that I could no longer be complicit, that I needed to push back against the systems that were in place that even say, you're going to be in a self-contained unit. Even the systems that are in place that allows my colleagues to say, no, they can't come into my classroom. So,
Mhm.
my scholars and I saw ourselves as us against the world in the building to some extent, because we were trying to prove everyone else wrong. And that was the beginning of me realizing not just the fight in the name of equity, but the live experiences that many folks don't understand because it isn't them, you know?
Right. Yeah. That's a interesting leadership lesson too for the ruckus maker to note because the idea of us versus them is very motivating, for people. So, it's unique and interesting that you mentioned that. So I can imagine, what that young student saying the prison experience was a wake up call for you. And you mentioned through that story, right? You started to challenge the system. So what did that look like? Can you give us maybe some like practical or bring us to some moments of what it looked like to challenge?
Absolutely. So, very complex, right? And so when you talk about
Mhm.
change management, then you realize that complexity and what's complicated are two different things. And so when you talk about what is complex, then you begin to understand that there's no true, genuine solution, right? And so I really tackled that from the space of, um, I wouldn't even say low hanging fruit. I thought about the networks that I did have. And so the administrator at the time when I was in the classroom was very supportive. And at the same time was like, hey, you have a problem, bring in that solution. So it made me kind of think about and think through what this looked like. So I spent some time connecting to colleagues who I did have a relationship with. And I had to be very intentional about that, right? Like I needed to understand, I needed to know which colleagues were also very empathetic in nature,
Mm.
which colleagues kind of went out of their way for, many of the scholars in the building, because I also understood that my scholars were coming from a place, and I hate to even use this word, but it was, it rings true to me right now, of needing to be deinstitutionalized. So, they were going into classrooms expecting to have the Erica experience as an educator. And I was trying to prepare them at the same time, how to navigate different types of classrooms. And so
Mm-hmm.
there was consistent meetings of the mind between myself and my colleagues. By the time that folks began to get on board through the ways that we were celebrating the success, and through the different ways that my scholars will actually appear and participate, then we were able to talk about, why don't you come into my classroom and we can co-teach together. So it went from a place of just kind of planning out conversations and ideas of, this is what they need, and these are the ways that they will engage. And let's have conversations when they don't. Let's have a plan when they have an issue.
Yeah.
And we put that in place and we followed that. But I think what was even more meaningful was to have a co-teaching experience. And when scholars didn't know who was the special ed teacher or who was the general ed teacher, and we had to
Sure.
put that down on paper so that it was concrete, and so that it was something that we could go back to and adjust. And then, the administrator at the time wanted us to put something in place that was sustainable. So I wasn't the only self-contained teacher. Initially I was, but when the other person came, now we had a system that was disrupting another system that was perpetuating the inequities that were already in place.
Wow. That's a concrete example too. And I sort of like the ambiguity of which teaches general ed, which one's special ed. We're all just teaching you, and we have high expectations and that kind of thing. I'll never forget. I taught many co-taught classes,
Mm-hmm.
and it is the system and the institution, the model. Often my colleagues just wanted me to teach. They wanted to help, like, quote unquote, their kids sort of operate from the background. But I had a lovely relationship with this guy, Eric, down in Champaign, Illinois. We also told a very big fib to our students. Like, we got along so well, right? We told them that we were brothers, and like even the faculty started to believe it too. And we're like, oh yeah, it kind of was like, oh, the boy that cried wolf. Maybe we shouldn't have told that lie. But he stepped up and he would teach. He would grade the whole class's stuff. Like, we took turns with that. But I think it elevated the whole experience for everybody involved, and just so important. So thank you for highlighting that too. So yeah, it's one way you challenge the system back then. Now you have Disrupt University. So what's Disrupt University all about?
Yeah, so Disrupt University, like, it actually comes from my research.
Okay.
So back when I went into, when I was aspiring to learn more at the point of time that I went, I didn't know it was about myself, but I was trying to, I had a nonprofit, and I was really looking at looking at research aligned to the nonprofit, and ended up taking some twists and turns into the space of Black teacher identity. So what I was trying to understand, for Black teachers who view themselves as being successful and their peers view themselves as being successful in urban settings, what are things that they are doing to support scholars in ways that are specific to the needs of the scholars. And so out of
Mm-hmm.
that, you do a frequency count, and that's like the very minimum level of understanding data, right?
Yeah.
Disruptor was the word that came up over and over and over and over. So when we talk about disruptor university, it's really about how do we disrupt the socialization process of scholars who are going to become educators, who are going to become the next whatever profession you want to fill in a blank with, in ways that allows them to see the commonalities and differences in others as a way to sustain and leverage relationships. When you think about what it means to be a 21st century learner or a 25th century educator and a global learner, all of those things really encompass how we are able to work across differences. And so understanding the lived experiences of the individual educators as a result of things that have happened. And here's an example. So I interviewed an educator who experienced going to school before desegregation and after desegregation. And so to
Wow.
hear, their experiences in their homes, their previous school to the new school was just mind blowing, right? And then to hear how they were able to take those experiences and support scholars who are considered, as living in the margin was even more, quite honestly, useful for even my own understandings. I know you talk about ruckus making, but it gave me a different perspective of looking at what that really means, because I haven't experienced the segregation to the extent that this person has. So Disrupting University is really all about, like, well, how do we provide those intercultural experiences that are continuous in the space of ongoing learning, so that we're looking across commonalities and differences and ways to develop authentic relationships.
Brilliant. Well, it sounds really wonderful, and I'm enjoying our conversation, Erica. We're going to get some messages in from our sponsors. And when we get back, I'm going to ask about a success story, right, at Disrupt the University, and then let's talk about the book, Centering Student Voice.
Absolutely.
Well, learn how to successfully navigate change, shape your school's success, and empower your teams with Harvard's certificate in school management and leadership. Get online PD that fits your schedule. Courses include leading change, leading school strategy and innovation, leading people, and leading learning. You can apply today at betterleadersbetterschools.com/Harvard. This show is also sponsored by TeachFX, which helps teachers record a lesson and automatically get personalized insights into their classroom conversation patterns and teaching practices. See TeachFX for yourself and learn about special partnership options for ruckus makers at teachfx.com/BLBS. And today's show is also proudly sponsored by Organized Binder. It's a program which gives students daily exposure to goal setting, reflective learning, time and task management, study strategies, organizational skills, and more. Organized Binder's color-coded system is implemented by the teacher through parallel process with the student, helping them create a predictable and dependable classroom routine. You can learn more and improve your students' executive functioning at organizedbinder.com. And we are back with Dr. Erica Glover. We were talking about her Disrupt University. She has a new book, which you should definitely pick up a copy. It's called Centering Student Voice. You could get it at centeringstudentvoice.com. And we're going to talk about the book in a second, but before we get there, do you have a case study, mini case study, or a success story about Disrupt University or the PD that you offer schools, right? And yeah, what's an insight, from said success story?
Yeah. So one of the things I truly think is important there's a couple of things. Number one, as educators, we espouse oftentimes to be lifelong learners, right? And so one of the things that I really push forward in the PD is, how do you engage in your lifelong learning throughout the course of not just your career? This is personally and professionally,
Sure.
as long as we're alive, right? And
Right.
with that being said, I was working with a group of educators, and we were unpacking this notion of being seen, valued, and heard. And so from the space of what's happening to me as a result of systems and policies that are in place, and how am I being discounted or dismissed? And so we spent some time really unpacking, when someone says they feel like they're being seen, valued, and heard, what does that look like? What are you seeing? What do you see? What do you feel? What are you experiencing? And we also spend time unpacking. So when you don't feel seen, valued, and heard, what does that look like? What are you experiencing? And then what supports do you need that aren't there? What supports and ways of continuing your learning would you like to have that you don't believe that are in place for you? And so, I mean, we spent about an hour really unpacking that. And for me as a facilitator, the goal was really for them to be able to not just connect with self, but now open yourself up for the space of understanding others within their lived experiences. And so from that, we pivoted to, now, how are you collecting that same data for your scholars? And it was really, really interesting to see how many people hadn't, right? Or to see how many people were able to collect some form of data from their scholars, but not actionalize it. So here in my seat as an educator, this is what I need you to do to support me. And I need you to listen. But how are we doing that the same way for scholars and families? How are we being intentional with what we want for someone to do for us? In the same ways that we would want them to do, that we would want them to be done for our scholars and our families. And so it was I read some research at one point in time that talks about perspective is that I think his name is Warren Chavez. I may be saying it incorrectly, but perspective taking is the anchor of empathy. Well,
Wow.
I really enjoy spending time with folks in that space, but I think it's also important to understand the need to not dismiss, which I'll talk about later, because when you're not
Mhm.
dismissing, you're understanding lived experiences differently. And so I had a lot of feedback from folks who were able to spend time, and we did some other things prior to those questions, really thinking about self and reflecting on their own personal experiences and thinking about how they felt when their needs weren't met, to oh wow, so yeah, this is happening differently to different types of people, and I might need to know how they feel. They want to be supported. Oftentimes folks talk about the difference between a golden rule and the platinum rule. So like,
Yeah,
how
right.
are we the way that they want to be treated was really how we were centering our conversation.
Got it. And you brought up this idea of, the need to not dismiss. What's that all about?
Yeah, so later yeah, I know we have a question around what I'm going to put on my marquee. So,
Oh,
but
okay. Okay.
so I go. You want me to go ahead into that now, or
You can do whatever you want. Yeah, it doesn't matter to me.
um, yeah, and it's happened to me, right? So I've shared a
Mhm.
story with a colleague, and the response back to the story and my lived experience was, "Oh, this happens to everybody. This happens to a lot of people." And
Mhm.
so, and this is when I was in HR, and so I was like, wow, that was that was very influential in terms of me, participating in my ongoing learning differently. And so, what I will say is, listen, and I want to be slangish here for intentionally. Listen without dismissing. And I think that oftentimes we'll listen to fix, especially as uh, administrators and supervisors. Sometimes will listen to fix instead of listening to first understand, and then to not dismiss a person's experience because we haven't had it. And so I think it's important in a space of diversity, equity, inclusion, sense of belonging that you are listening to not dismiss, especially when you haven't had the experiences of others.
Yeah, it's easy to discount, but man, so invalidating. Like,
Yeah. Oh,
you
yeah.
really, as a leader, I did a training on trust recently. And trust is boiled down to really solid relationships, good judgment, and consistency doing what you say you'll do. And if you're going to be dismissing people's experiences, you might as well just say, I want a poor culture, right? I don't want people to trust me. Like, this is not going to be a fun place to work. So thank you for sharing that. Okay, so Centering Student Voice, yeah, it's out. And again, you can pick it up at centeringstudentvoice.com. And congratulations on publishing that one.
Thank
Um,
you.
you talked earlier about this idea of understanding yourself, right? And you talk
Yes.
about this in the book, but how does understanding who I am as an individual help me set the environment, right, to make quality connections with my students?
Well, I think I would actually want to begin with answering that question to thinking about what, as a former administrator, pains that
Okay.
I've worked with teachers in understanding or trying to decrease. And I call them the 3 Ds: distraction that leads to disengagement, that leads to discipline, right? And so
Yeah.
oftentimes people just want the quick remedy. And at the center of that are those authentic relationships. And I don't mean relationships that occur as a default of you having a classroom because you're a teacher. I mean relationships that allows you to help scholars to be able to navigate the spaces that they're in ways that helps them understand how to advocate for themselves. Now
Okay.
going back to your question, it's in order to do that work, you have to understand how your experiences are different from your scholars. And right now, I'm just using the word scholars. Your experiences are different from your colleagues. Your experiences are different from your administrators. And so in the book, I'm really talking and exploring, this idea, this notion of, well, who am I? How did I come to be? When I when I teach and how I teach, where did that come from? Where did I get that? And how did it support me in the way that I learned? But then at the same time, how might it be different and not support the scholar the same, right? Even when it comes to having conversations when I'm frustrated. And this is why that notion of emotional intelligence is important. How am I reflecting on my triggers? What am I,
Yeah.
when you think about the ladder of inference and how I draw conclusions, what has happened that I'm selecting certain data to make a decision upon? And how do I go back and unpack that in ways that allows me to think differently, but also be willing to learn differently? And so I think oftentimes when we are working to adjust practices in the classroom, both as an educator or as a leader, we skip the importance of transforming that mindset. And so I spent a lot of time using my own personal experiences, being vulnerable to help folks
Yeah.
understand exactly what I was thinking and how I was trying to pivot out of that moment.
Got it. Thank you. And anything else you want to say about the book? Like, I guess the question I would ask is, what result do you anticipate the reader getting after going through your book? Their mindset's been shifted. You've given some practical, resources and that kind of thing. But what result, do they get?
So there's conversations around the difference between allyship, advocacy, and activism. I
Hmm.
believe that an educator who has read this book and would deem themselves as being successful in the understanding implication of the things that I share is you're moving into the space of advocacy or activism, right? You are reading and learning and understanding, but you're also doing something. You're disrupting systems in ways that are marginalized groups of people. You're committed to ongoing learning and differently, and you're becoming more culturally aware. You're moving from this idea notion of being a monocultural or looking at things from a monocultural perspective in terms of just what you've experienced to
Sure.
understanding that folks see the world differently and learn differently. And as a result, I'm adjusting my practices in ways that are personalizing learning versus based upon what might be convenient for me or what I'm
Mhm.
really used to.
Yeah. And with students from everywhere, a diverse student body, which is the
Absolutely.
reality of most schools, this will help you be, yeah, a much more responsive leader and create more results for your community. So awesome. Thanks for doing the hard work. Uh, getting, I don't know how you unplan a book. Like it takes a lot of work, but I'm glad it's out in the world. And you mentioned you kind of riffed on the marquee question. So I'll ask about your dream school. So if
Yeah.
Dr. Erica Glover was building her dream school and you weren't constrained by any resources, your only limitation was your imagination, how would you build this school? What would be the three guiding principles?
Ah, first guiding principle would be personalized learning that is actionalized. Scholars at various ages would be able to choose their pathway for learning, not choose their career pathway, right? But choose their pathway for learning. Is it online? Is it hybrid? Is it PBL? Is it based upon inquiry based learning? Like, what is it? And they'll be introduced, so they'll be able to make, and parents as well, decisions based upon what they're learning. But you're not stuck to it. If you want to shift and make a move in the next quarter or whatever have you, then that is an option. I would also focus on global learning, especially
Hmm.
because scholars have access to technology that we didn't, and they are learning from folks across the country. So cultural awareness in different spaces would be another. And then I will recruit non-traditional educators. And I'm not saying just in the space of wraparound programs where you're being social workers or board certified behavior analysts. I'm talking about folks who have lived experiences but can make connections back to the content. I think oftentimes because the way we professionalize education, we miss out on a lot of folks who are actually coaches and teachers already in the ways that they're existing. And then I would really dive into amplifying voice to action. The adjustments and practices that we have in place are based upon what we're hearing our scholars and our families say and do. That policy would change based upon who we are serving, not based upon those who are developing the systems and the structures in place. And so those would be the principles of my dream school. And then obviously, if we have all the resources that we want, the compensation package and the amount of educators that we have in those spaces would definitely change.
Absolutely. Cool. Hey, we covered a lot of ground today, Erica. So, of everything we discussed, what's the one thing you want a ruckus maker to remember?
Mm. At disrupting takes courage, but it also is aligned to who you are and the unique difference that you bring to the world. And be committed to your uniqueness. Be committed to who you're supposed to be, who you were called to be, because you are solving a problem that no one else in this world can solve.